In the long and restless history of humanity, few eras have captured the imagination and the dread quite like the Middle Ages. Stretching roughly from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th, this millennium was not simply an age of castles, cathedrals, and chivalric knights. It was also an era of profound cruelty, institutionalized fear, and a fundamentally different understanding of justice, sin, and the human body. To comprehend the world that gave rise to its most harrowing practices, we must first understand the society that created them. A world where the church and the crown were inseparable, where disease and death were constant companions, where superstition and theology governed every courtroom, and where the suffering of the body was considered a legitimate, even necessary path to truth. What you are about to hear is not sensationalism, it is history. The methods of coercion, punishment, and confinement that arose during the medieval period were products of their time, shaped by theology, legal tradition, political power, and the desperate human need to impose order upon a chaotic world. Some of the instruments and institutions that have passed into legend are more nuanced than popular culture suggests. Others are precisely as dark as their reputation implies. Throughout this narration, we will examine three of the most enduring and haunting chapters of this history: the Iron Maiden, an instrument whose very name conjures terror; the Inquisition, an institution whose reach extended across continents and centuries; and the medieval prison, a world unto itself that shaped the fates of thousands. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let the centuries fall away. Imagine a world without electric light, without antibiotics, without the presumption of innocence. Imagine a world where a confession extracted under torment was considered the highest form of legal proof, where a man or woman accused of heresy could vanish into a dungeon and never emerge, where the architecture of suffering was as carefully designed as any cathedral. This is the world we enter now, not to celebrate it, but to understand it, to bear witness, and to ensure that the shadows of the past are never forgotten. Few objects in the history of punishment have inspired as much fear, fascination, and misunderstanding as the Iron Maiden. Even today, the name alone conjures images of a towering metal sarcophagus shaped in the likeness of a woman, its interior studded with lethal spikes, its doors swinging shut with terrible finality upon some unfortunate soul condemned by law or tyranny. The image is powerful, it is evocative, and, as historians have spent considerable energy demonstrating, it is largely a product of the early modern imagination rather than a routine instrument of medieval justice. To understand the Iron Maiden, we must first separate myth from history, and that journey itself tells us something profound about how societies construct narratives of terror. The devices that are today called Iron Maidens, and there are several in museum collections across Europe, did not appear in historical records as active instruments of execution or torture during the medieval period. Proper. The earliest documented mention of a coffin-shaped, spike-lined enclosure being used as a judicial instrument comes from the late 18th century, when accounts emerged from the city of Nuremberg, Germany, describing a device purportedly used in earlier centuries. These accounts were subsequently scrutinized, and many historians concluded that the Nuremberg Iron Maiden was, at least in part, an assemblage, a composite object pieced together from unrelated medieval artifacts and presented to a curious public as a unified instrument of horror. The context for this reassessment matters enormously. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a period of intense romantic fascination with the medieval past. Writers, artists, and museum curators across Europe were constructing, sometimes literally, a vision of the Middle Ages as an age of superstition, barbarism, and Gothic darkness. Iron Maidens fit perfectly into this narrative. Whether or not they had been used in the manner described, they embodied everything that the Enlightenment wished to define itself against: the irrational, the cruel, the pre-modern. The most famous Iron Maiden in the world resided for centuries in the Nuremberg Museum, and its history is a lesson in the archaeology of fear. The device stood roughly 6 feet tall, the approximate height of a human being, and was fashioned to resemble a woman robed in the style of the Virgin Mary. Its hinged front panel, when opened, revealed an interior lined with iron spikes, carefully positioned so that, should a person be placed inside and the doors closed, the spikes would pierce the body at non-vital points: the shoulders, the arms, the thighs. This placement, according to the most terrifying interpretations, was deliberate, designed not for immediate death, but for a prolonged and agonizing process of bleeding and suffering. But here is where the historical record becomes complicated. When 19th century scholars and curators examined the Nuremberg device in detail, they found inconsistencies that suggested it was not a single coherent instrument created for a specific purpose. The metalwork appeared to come from different periods. The spikes, rather than being original components, seem to have been added at various points. The internal mechanisms did not function in the manner that the popular legend required. By the time of the Second World War, during which the original Nuremberg device was damaged and subsequently lost, the consensus among serious historians had already begun to shift toward skepticism about its use as an active torture instrument. This does not mean that the Iron Maiden is entirely fictional as a concept. Devices resembling coffins or enclosures were used in various contexts during the medieval and early modern periods. Body-shaped cages, known in German as Schandmantel or cloaks of shame, were employed as a form of public humiliation in some German-speaking regions. A condemned person might be placed within such a device and displayed in a public square, subjected to the scorn and sometimes the violence of passers-by. These were instruments of social punishment rather than physical torture, but they demonstrate that the cultural imagination that eventually produced the Iron Maiden myth had roots in genuine practice. The Iron Maiden, whether entirely fabricated or grounded in some shadowy historical reality, tells us something essential about the medieval relationship between punishment and the body. In the medieval legal framework that prevailed across most of Europe, influenced heavily by Roman law, canon law, and local custom, the body of the accused was not inviolable. It was, in a very real sense, the property of the law. To extract truth from a body, to punish a body for transgression, to mark a body as a sign of the community's judgment, these were considered legitimate, even necessary, functions of justice. This was not cruelty for its own sake, or at least it was not perceived as such by those who designed and administered these systems. Medieval legal theorists distinguished carefully between different categories of physical coercion. There was torture, proper, the application of pain to compel a confession, which was hedged about with procedural rules in many jurisdictions. There was corporal punishment, ranging from flogging to mutilation, which was applied as a sentence upon conviction. There was public humiliation, which served the social function of marking the transgressor before the community. And there was execution, which itself took many forms, calibrated to the nature and severity of the crime. The Iron Maiden, in the popular imagination, collapsed all of these categories into a single, supremely efficient machine of terror. Its appeal as a symbol lay precisely in its totality. It embraced, it confined, it wounded, and it silenced. It was the dungeon and the scaffold and the confession chamber all in one. That such a device may never have existed in quite the form described does not diminish the historical significance of the fear it embodies, for the fear was real even if the object was not. To understand the Iron Maiden in its proper context, we must turn to the instruments of coercion that were genuinely and extensively used during the medieval period, devices that appear not merely in legend but in legal records, court proceedings, theological treatises, and the accounts of those who witnessed or experienced their application first-hand. Among the most widely documented was the strappado, a technique that required almost no specialized equipment. A prisoner's hands were bound behind their back. They were then hoisted by a rope attached to their wrists, either held aloft for extended periods or repeatedly raised and dropped, sometimes with weights attached to the feet to dislocate the shoulders. The strappado appears in court records across medieval Europe and was formally regulated in many jurisdictions. Its application was supposed to be overseen by a physician, limited in duration, and applied only in cases where there was already substantial evidence of guilt. In practice, such regulations were frequently disregarded. The rack, perhaps the instrument most immediately associated with medieval torture in the popular imagination, was a wooden frame upon which a prisoner was stretched, their wrists and ankles attached to opposite ends, and the mechanism slowly tightened until the joints of the shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees were placed under extreme stress. The rack appeared in English prisons by at least the 15th century and was particularly associated with the Tower of London, where its use in interrogating suspected traitors and heretics is well documented. Unlike the Iron Maiden, the rack requires no mythology. Its existence and use are amply attested. The thumbscrew was a compact device of terrible efficiency, a vise designed to crush the thumbs, or sometimes the toes or other extremities, producing intense pain without necessarily causing permanent injury, at least in its less extreme applications. Variants of the thumbscrew appear in Scottish records from the 17th century, and similar principles were applied in various forms across medieval Europe. The device had the advantage, from the perspective of the interrogator, of being portable, controllable, and capable of being escalated gradually. The iron boot, or brodequin, encased the leg from foot to knee in a wooden or iron frame. Wedges were then driven between the frame and the leg, crushing the flesh and bone progressively. This instrument was used extensively in the interrogations associated with the Inquisition and appears in numerous legal records from France, Scotland, and other European territories. Unlike the rack or strappado, the boot frequently caused permanent injury. The bones of the lower leg might be shattered beyond repair, leaving the survivor crippled for life. What all of these instruments shared, and what the Iron Maiden, in its legendary form, shared with them, was a fundamental premise that the body, under sufficient duress, would yield the truth. This premise, which modern psychology and jurisprudence have thoroughly demolished, was the operating assumption of medieval criminal procedure. Confession was considered the queen of proofs, the most compelling evidence a court could obtain. And if confession required pain to extract, then pain was the instrument of justice. No institution in the history of the medieval world has cast a longer shadow than the Inquisition. Its name has become synonymous with persecution, with the suppression of dissent, with the terrifying convergence of religious authority and coercive power. Monty Python made comedy of it. Countless novels and films have dramatized its horrors. And yet, the institution itself, or rather, the series of related institutions that bore that name across different periods and geographies, was more varied, more complex, and in some respects more procedurally sophisticated than its reputation suggests. To understand the Inquisition is to understand the medieval church at the height of its temporal power, and to understand what happens when any institution becomes convinced that it possesses absolute truth and the obligation to defend it by any means necessary. The word inquisition derives from the Latin inquisitio, meaning simply inquiry or investigation. In the early centuries of Christianity, the Church had various mechanisms for addressing doctrinal disputes. but these were generally non-coercive. Errant believers were corrected through preaching, debate, and in extreme cases, excommunication, exclusion from the sacraments and the community of the faithful. The shift toward systematic, coercive investigation of heresy emerged gradually, driven by two parallel developments: the spread of popular heretical movements across 12th century Europe, and the increasing willingness of secular rulers to collaborate with ecclesiastical authorities in suppressing them. The Cathars of southern France, also known as Albigensians, after the city of Albi, represented the first major challenge that prompted an organized inquisitorial response. The Cathars were dualists. They believed that the material world was the creation of an evil deity, and that the spiritual world alone was the domain of the good God. They rejected the Catholic sacraments, the authority of the church hierarchy, and many of the theological foundations upon which medieval Christian society was built. By the late 12th century, Catharism had spread widely through the Languedoc region of southern France, attracting adherents at every level of society. The response of Rome was initially pastoral. The great preacher Dominic Guzman, who would later be canonized, traveled through the region attempting to persuade the Cathars through argument and example. When persuasion failed, something more forceful followed. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued the Decretal ad abolendam, which established the principle that bishops were obligated to investigate heresy in their dioceses, systematically to inquire, to examine, and to hand over convicted heretics to the secular arm for punishment. This was the seed from which the formal Inquisition would grow. The critical development came in 1231, when Pope Gregory IX formally appointed the Dominican and Franciscan friars as papal inquisitors, specialists in the investigation of heresy, who operated with a mandate directly from Rome, independent of the local ecclesiastical hierarchy. These papal inquisitors could move across diocesan boundaries, summon witnesses and accused alike, and conduct proceedings according to a standardized procedural framework that was codified and refined over the following decades. The procedural framework that governed the medieval Inquisition was, by the standards of the time, remarkably systematic. Inquisitors were supposed to follow a defined sequence. They would arrive in a region and offer a period of grace, during which those who had lapsed into heresy could come forward voluntarily, confess, and receive relatively mild penances. After this period expired, the formal investigation began. Witnesses were summoned and examined in secret. The accused were confronted with the charges against them, though not necessarily with the identity of their accusers, who were protected from potential reprisals. Examination of the accused was conducted under oath, and the inquisitor was expected to probe carefully, using leading questions and cross-examination to test the consistency of responses. The theory was that an inquisitor's primary goal was not punishment, but conversion, the return of the errant soul to the community of the faithful. A heretic who genuinely repented and abjured their errors was supposed to be received back into the church, albeit with penances that might include pilgrimages. The wearing of crosses sewn onto their clothing as a mark of penitence, fines, or imprisonment. Only the relapsed, those who had previously abjured heresy and returned to it, and the impenitent, those who refused to recant, were in theory to be handed over to the secular authorities for capital punishment. The church itself could not shed blood. That was the province of the state. But the state, in medieval Europe, was obligated to execute those whom the church condemned. The question of torture within the Inquisition is perhaps the most charged and most misunderstood aspect of the institution's history. Torture was not a founding element of the inquisitorial process. In 1252, however, Pope Innocent IV issued the bull Ad Extirpanda, which explicitly authorized inquisitors to use torture to extract confessions from accused heretics, but under carefully defined conditions. Torture was to be applied only when there was already substantial evidence of guilt, only when other means of obtaining a confession had failed, only once, and without the permanent maiming or killing of the subject. Medical supervision was theoretically required. The inquisitor himself was not supposed to be present at the actual application of torture, which was administered by secular officials. In practice, the regulations were frequently circumvented. The prohibition on applying torture only once was reinterpreted to mean only once per session, allowing torture to be resumed across multiple days. The requirement that confessions obtained under torture be freely confirmed the following day when the prisoner was no longer in pain created a procedural loop. If the prisoner recanted the confession, they could be tortured again on the grounds that they had relapsed. The involvement of secular torturers allowed inquisitors to maintain a technical fiction of non-participation, and the extraordinary pressure of inquisitorial proceedings, the isolation, the uncertainty, the knowledge of what awaited the impenitent, meant that many accused persons confessed without any physical coercion at all. The testimony of those who passed through the inquisitorial process provides some of the most haunting primary sources available to historians of the medieval period. The registers kept by inquisitors, often meticulous, remarkably detailed records of proceedings, survive in considerable numbers, particularly from the French Inquisition of the 13th and 14th centuries. The registers of Jacques Fournier, who served as inquisitor in the Pyrenean region of Ariège in the early 14th century before becoming Pope Benedict XII, are among the most extraordinary documents in medieval history. They record, in intimate and often painful detail, the lives, beliefs, and fears of the inhabitants of villages in the foothills of the Pyrenees, peasants and nobles, men and women, the learned and the illiterate, whose encounters with the inquisitorial process have been preserved for posterity with an almost novelistic completeness. When most people today invoke the Inquisition, They are thinking not of the medieval papal institution, but of the Spanish Inquisition, and the two, while related in name and in some procedural elements, were, in important respects, very different institutions. The Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, with papal authorization. But it was from the beginning a royal institution rather than a papal one. Its primary targets, in its early decades, were not Cathar heretics or Waldensians, but conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, who were suspected of continuing to practice Judaism in secret, and later Moriscos. Muslims who had converted to Christianity under pressure, but were suspected of crypto-Islamic practice. The Spanish Inquisition operated according to procedural rules that were in many respects more formal and more regulated than those of the medieval papal institution. Defendants had the right to be informed of the charges against them, to call witnesses on their behalf, and to be represented by counsel. The use of torture was regulated, though the regulations were imperfect, and the application of the most severe physical methods required the approval of senior inquisitors. The institution maintained its own prisons, separate from secular jails, which by contemporary standards were not particularly harsh. The rate of capital punishment associated with the Spanish Inquisition historically exaggerated to extraordinary degrees by Protestant propaganda, and the so-called Black Legend has been estimated by modern historians at between 3 and 5% of those tried over the institution's more than 3 centuries of operation. None of this is to minimize the suffering inflicted by the Spanish Inquisition, or to defend an institution that imprisoned, tortured, and killed thousands of people for matters of religious belief and practice. It is, rather, to insist on historical accuracy in the face of a mythology that has, in some ways, obscured rather than illuminated the real horrors of the institution. The auto da fe, the public ceremony at which sentences were pronounced and, in extreme cases, condemned heretics were handed over to the secular arm, for burning was a theatrical assertion of the Church's power, a spectacle of sacred authority made manifest in suffering, that it was not as frequent or as
lethal as legend suggests does not make it less terrible. It makes it, if anything, more comprehensible, and therefore more disturbing. What the Inquisition, in all its forms, created was not primarily an apparatus of mass physical torture. It was an architecture of fear. The knowledge that anyone might be denounced, that neighbors and family members might testify against one another, that proceedings were conducted in secrecy, that the identity of accusers was protected. These features of the inquisitorial process created a social climate in which surveillance and self-censorship became survival strategies. Communities subjected to inquisitorial investigation did not primarily suffer from the rack and the boot. They suffered from the constant awareness that any expression of unorthodox belief, any deviation from prescribed practice, any association with persons under suspicion might draw the attention of the inquisitors. The Inquisitor's Manual, the genre of text produced to guide inquisitors in their work, provides a chilling window into this architecture. Bernard Guy, one of the most prolific and feared inquisitors of the early 14th century, produced a Practica Inquisitionis that laid out in systematic detail the characteristics of each heretical group, the questions to be asked of suspected members, and the techniques for detecting evasion and deception. Guy was acutely aware that experienced heretics, particularly the perfecti, the spiritual elite of the Cathar movement, had developed sophisticated strategies for answering inquisitorial questions without technically lying. They would equivocate, invoke mental reservations, or redirect questions. The inquisitor's task was to be at least as sophisticated as his adversaries, to understand not merely the doctrine of the heresy but the psychology of the heretic. The Inquisition, in this sense, was a battle of wits conducted in the shadow of tremendous asymmetrical power. The accused faced imprisonment, torture, the loss of property, and potentially death. The inquisitor faced the possibility of professional censure if he exceeded his mandate. That some inquisitors used their position for personal enrichment, settling scores, or seizing the property of the condemned for their own benefit, is documented. That others were genuine believers in their mission, convinced that they were saving souls from eternal damnation by compelling confession and repentance, is equally documented. The horror of the institution lies precisely in this ambiguity, in the knowledge that terrible things were done, and that many of those who did them considered themselves to be acting in the service of God. Of all the institutions associated with medieval punishment, the prison is in some ways the most paradoxical. Modern societies regard incarceration as the primary mechanism of punishment. The deprivation of liberty, for a defined period determined by the severity of the crime, is the central response of the criminal justice system to criminal behavior. In the medieval period, this understanding of imprisonment was largely absent. Prison, in the dominant medieval conception, was not primarily a punishment, it was a holding mechanism. Persons accused of crimes were imprisoned to ensure that they appeared for trial. Persons condemned were imprisoned to ensure that they were available for the actual punishment, which might take the form of corporal suffering, mutilation, execution, or exile. Imprisonment as a terminal sentence in its own right was relatively rare in secular criminal law, though it was employed by the Church in heresy proceedings. This does not mean that medieval prisons were benign institutions. Far from it. The conditions in which prisoners were held, the physical environment, the availability of food and water, the management of disease, the treatment by guards, the regulation of contact with the outside world, varied enormously depending on the status of the prisoner, the wealth of the institution, the inclination of the jailer, and the purpose of the confinement. For wealthy or politically important prisoners, imprisonment could be relatively comfortable. A guarded room in a castle or tower, with access to books, writing materials, visitors, and food purchased or provided by family members. For the poor, the anonymous, and the condemned, it was something altogether different. The physical structures that served as prisons in medieval Europe were as varied as the societies that produced them. Royal castles contained dedicated prison towers, the Tower of London being the most famous surviving example. Designed to hold high-status political prisoners whose continued existence served the interests of their captors, municipal prisons operated by towns and cities were generally less architecturally impressive. Converted buildings, towers above city gates, or dedicated structures whose primary virtues were security and low cost. Monastic prisons, operated by religious houses, confined those whom the church wished to hold apart from secular society. And dungeons, the word comes from the French donjon, meaning the main tower of a castle, While not uniformly the subterranean horror chambers of popular imagination, could indeed be deeply unpleasant places of confinement below ground level. No medieval prison has captured the historical imagination quite as powerfully as the Tower of London. Built initially by William the Conqueror in the years following the Norman conquest of 1066, the tower complex expanded over the centuries into a formidable concentric fortress on the north bank of the Thames. Its primary purpose was never simply incarceration. The tower served as a royal palace, a treasury, an armory, a mint, and a menagerie. But from an early date it also served as a place of royal imprisonment, and the names of those confined within its walls read as a roll call of English political history. Among the tower's most famous prisoners were two of the sons of King Edward IV, the so-called princes in the tower, who disappeared within its walls in 1483 and under circumstances that have never been definitively resolved and continue to generate historical debate. Thomas More was imprisoned in the bell tower before his execution in 1835. Queen of England, spent her final days in the Queen's house before her beheading on Tower Green. Walter Raleigh was confined within the tower on 3 separate occasions, spending years within its walls and using the time to write his monumental history of the world. Guy Fawkes, arrested in the immediate aftermath of the gunpowder plot of 1605, was subjected to torture within the tower before his execution. The tower's architecture reflected the hierarchical nature of medieval and early modern imprisonment. The most eminent prisoners were housed in the residential towers of the complex. Rooms that, while certainly not comfortable by modern standards, provided stone walls rather than earth, a fireplace, natural light from windows, and space enough to move. Lesser prisoners might find themselves in considerably harsher conditions, and the tower's dungeons, though often embellished in popular accounts, were real enough. Dark, damp, cold, and frequently occupied by persons who had no reason to expect that they would ever emerge from them. The dungeon of medieval imagination, the lightless underground chamber, accessible only by a trapdoor or a heavily guarded gate, populated by rats and the sound of dripping water, is not entirely mythological. Castle basements and tower foundations were frequently used as holding areas for prisoners, particularly those deemed to require maximum security or maximum misery. The conditions were often severe. Cold stone floors, inadequate ventilation, minimal light, and limited access to food, water, and human contact could combine to devastating effect on prisoners' physical and mental health. The oubliette, from the French oublier, to forget, occupies a particularly dark corner of medieval prison mythology. The term refers to a cell accessible only from above, a vertical shaft or pit into which a prisoner could be lowered, and from which, barring external intervention, they could never escape. The implication of the name is that the prisoner was placed to be forgotten, confined not merely from society, but from memory itself, left to die of neglect rather than executed outright. Evidence for the routine use of oubliettes is difficult to establish. The term itself is relatively late, and many structures identified in castle tours as oubliettes were likely storage pits rather than holding cells. But the concept, the deliberate abandonment of a human being in a sealed space, is not without historical basis. The use of underground confinement as a deliberate punishment, rather than merely a security measure, appears in various medieval contexts. Church prisons, in particular, sometimes employed a form of confinement called immuration, the walling up of a prisoner in a small cell with limited access to light, food, and human contact, as a punishment for severe religious transgressions. Monks and nuns found guilty of serious moral offenses might be immured within monastery walls. In extreme cases, the punishment was intended as a form of living death, a permanent exclusion from the community of the living. Accounts of immuration appear in both ecclesiastical records and hagiographic literature, though the frequency of the practice is difficult to assess. Beyond the dramatic extremes of the Tower of London and the Oubliette, the daily reality of medieval imprisonment was shaped primarily by poverty, disease, and neglect. Municipal prisons, in particular, were often chronically underfunded, poorly managed, and catastrophically overcrowded. The practice of garnish, by which new prisoners were expected to pay existing inmates or the jailer for the privilege of sleeping space, shared food, or protection from violence, meant that the wealthy could purchase relative comfort while the poor were left to whatever remained. Jailers were typically paid little or nothing by the civic authorities who employed them. They were expected to supplement their income through the fees charged to prisoners and their families. Disease was the great equalizer and the great killer of medieval prisons. Gall fever, a term that covered what we now recognize primarily as typhus, spread by body lice, was endemic in overcrowded, poorly ventilated prison environments. Outbreaks of gall fever were recorded from English prisons with particular frequency, and the disease sometimes spread beyond prison walls when prisoners were brought to court. The phenomenon of black assizes, during which judges, jurors, and court officers died of disease brought by prisoners from fetid jails, is documented in several instances from the medieval and early modern periods. Food provision in medieval prisons was, for most inmates, a matter of survival rather than sustenance. The standard prison allowance in many English jurisdictions was bread and water, a quantity barely sufficient to maintain life over an extended period. Prisoners with family connections and financial resources could supplement this from outside. Their families might pay for food to be brought in, and some prison developed rudimentary markets at which prisoners could purchase provisions. For those without such connections, survival depended on the charity of religious institutions. Monasteries and churches sometimes provided alms for prisoners, or on the informal economies of the prison itself. Medieval punishment was rarely a private affair. The stocks, the pillory, the cage, the public whipping post, all of these instruments were designed not merely to cause suffering but to display it, to make the transgressor visible to the community, and to communicate through that visibility a set of messages about social order, moral boundaries, and the power of the authorities who administered justice. Imprisonment, despite its seemingly private character, often had a similarly public dimension. The public procession of prisoners through streets lined with onlookers, subjected to jeering, thrown garbage, or even physical assault, was a routine feature of medieval justice. Condemned prisoners were paraded to the place of execution along routes designed to maximize their visibility and the opportunity for public participation in the spectacle of punishment. The pillory was not a prison in itself, but the experience of being confined in it. Locked in a wooden frame in a public square, unable to move, exposed to whatever the crowd wished to inflict, incorporated elements of both confinement and public shaming that overlapped with the prison experience. The public reading of sentences at the gates of prisons was a common practice. Passers-by would learn of the crimes of those within, reinforcing the social boundaries that imprisonment was intended to enforce, and the prison itself, as a physical structure, communicated messages through its architecture. Its towers, its fortified walls, were visible assertions of authority, reminders to the free population of what awaited those who transgressed the law. The relationship between the medieval church and the institution of imprisonment was complex and multifaceted. The Church operated its own prisons, both for the confinement of accused heretics awaiting inquisitorial proceedings and for the punishment of those convicted of ecclesiastical offenses. The prison as a place of penance had theological resonance. Confinement, deprivation, and suffering could be understood as forms of spiritual discipline, a mortification of the flesh that prepared the soul for God. Some prison sentences imposed by ecclesiastical courts were explicitly framed in these terms. The prisoner was to spend their confinement in prayer, fasting, and contemplation, with the suffering of imprisonment serving as a form of purgatorial cleansing. At the same time, the Church was among the most consistent advocates for the humane treatment of prisoners, at least in theory. Canon law and theological tradition consistently maintained that prisoners should be provided with the basic necessities of life, that they should have access to the sacraments, and that their souls were no less valuable before God than those of free persons. Religious orders took on specific ministries to prisoners. The Mercedarians and Trinitarians were founded in part for the ransom of Christian prisoners held by Muslim powers, and friars regularly led secular prisons to provide spiritual comfort, practical assistance, and advocacy for the imprisoned. The tension between the Church's coercive power and its pastoral mandate, between the inquisitor and the confessor, between the sentence and the sacrament, was never fully resolved in the medieval period. It is a tension that runs through the entire history of punishment in Western civilization, and one that, in various forms, persists to the present day. We have traveled a great distance through time tonight, through the shadowed halls of medieval justice, through the chambers of the Inquisition, through the dripping stones of dungeons long since fallen to ruin. We have encountered the Iron Maiden, and found in it not simply a device of terror, but a mirror held up to the society that imagined it. We have walked through the history of the Inquisition, and found in it not a simple story of villains and victims, but a complex and troubling account of what happens when certainty becomes absolute and power becomes sacred. We have descended into the medieval prison, and found in it not merely darkness, but the full spectrum of human experience, suffering, yes, but also solidarity, ingenuity, and the stubborn persistence of the human spirit. What does this history teach us? It teaches, first and foremost, the contingency of justice, the unsettling fact that what any given society considers a legitimate, even necessary, response to crime and transgression is not a timeless truth, but a historical product shaped by the assumptions, values, and power structures of its moment. The medieval jurist who authorized torture to compel confession was not a monster operating outside the law. He was a professional operating within it, according to the best legal theory of his time. The inquisitor who interrogated a suspected heretic believed himself to be performing an act of spiritual mercy. The jailer who left prisoners to the mercy of disease and hunger may never have been asked to consider whether they had any claim upon his conscience. This is not a counsel of relativism. The suffering inflicted by these institutions was real, and it was wrong, and the fact that it was normalized does not make it less wrong. It is rather a counsel of humility. Every age creates its own Iron Maidens, its own instruments and institutions of coercion that seem, to those operating within them, not merely acceptable but necessary. The measure of a civilization is not whether it has such instruments, but whether it can recognize them, name them, and in time dismantle them. The Middle Ages, for all their darkness, were not a static world. Legal reformers challenged the use of torture on both pragmatic and moral grounds. Religious visionaries argued for the dignity of all human souls. regardless of their crimes or their heresies. Prisoners wrote, from their confinement, some of the most enduring literature of the era. Boethius, in his cell awaiting execution, composed the Consolation of Philosophy. Thomas Malory, in prison, wrote what would become Le Morte d'Arthur. The human spirit, subjected to every form of confinement and coercion that the medieval world could devise, persisted. It persists still. We began this journey with a simple observation, that to understand the past is not to excuse it. We end with its corollary, that to understand the past is to arm ourselves against the future. The instruments may change, the institutions may take new forms and new names, but the impulses that drove the creation of the Iron Maiden, the Inquisition and the medieval dungeon, the impulse to silence, to compel, to confine those who challenge the established order, are not relics of a distant century. They are permanent features of the human condition, and the only defense against them is the kind of careful, unflinching, historically informed attention that we have attempted to bring along Knight's journey. The darkness of the Middle Ages is not entirely past, but neither is the light that eventually broke through it, and it is in that ongoing negotiation between shadow and illumination that the story of human civilization continues to be written.